again, good evening. My name is Kent Herink. The reason I'm up here tonight is I'm the current president of the Des Moines Library Foundation Board of Directors. The AViD series is funded by the Des Moines Public Library Foundation. With the current budget cuts, it's been brought to our attention many times that if this funding didn't exist, the AViD series would not continue. With that in mind, I would like to thank our principal sponsors for 2010. They are Humanities Iowa, Wells Fargo, Nationwide, Douglas and Deborah West, Hoyt Sherman Place, Drake University, and the Iowa History Center at Simpson. Tonight it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Central Library for the presentation by author Peter Bognanni, many of whom I believe in the audience know him. Before we start tonight, I would like to remind you that you should turn off your cell phones so that the presentation is not interrupted. And I would also ask you two things. One is there's an evaluation form in your program, and it'd be great if you'd fill that out. It would help us in our programming. And also, you'll notice there's a contribution envelope, and given the importance of money to continuing the AViD program, it'd be great if you'd fill that out as well. After the presentation, there will be a brief question and answer session, and Beaverdale Books is selling Peter's book after the presentation, and I'm told he'd be happy to autograph them for you. Now I'd like to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Stephen Lovely. Stephen brings an intriguing background to tonight's presentation. I was surprised by that, or when I read this. He started by getting an English major at Kenyon College. Then he spent a couple of years working on the editorial staff of Cell, and for those of you who don't know, that's probably the leading journal in the field of biology. He then spent 7 years as a night clerk in the pediatric intensive care unit at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. He attended the Writers' Workshop from 1990 to 92, and then in 2005 he became the director and is currently the director of the Iowa Young Writers Studio, a summer residential creative writing program for high school students. Stephen.
Thank you. Peter Bognanni's deepest, darkest secret is that he wasn't born in Iowa. He was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He moved to Des Moines when he was 9 months old and grew up on the northwest side. As many of you know, his mother, Kathy, has been a librarian at the Franklin branch for many years, and his father, Sal, works for the Iowa health system. Peter attended Moore Elementary School, where he wrote a story about a turkey who, afraid of being decapitated on Thanksgiving, built an underground turkey lair. While attending Hoover High School, he played in what he calls a terrible punk band. But after reading his debut novel, The House of Tomorrow, we've learned that in the lexicon of high school punk, terrible can be high praise. Peter once dressed up as Clifford the Big Red Dog for a library event. Clearly, he's come a long way. Peter attended Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and majored in history. From 2003 to 2005, he studied at the Iowa Writers' Workshop in Iowa City with Frank Conroy, James McPherson, Elizabeth McCracken, ZZ Packer, Adam Hazlitt, and Chris Offutt, a dazzling roster of teachers if there ever was one. Peter was awarded a prestigious teaching writing fellowship at Iowa and taught fiction writing during his 2 years there. He went on to teach at St. Augustine College, the City Colleges of Chicago, and Macalester College, where he's currently a visiting instructor of creative writing. Peter's short fiction and humor pieces have appeared in Gulf Coast, the Bellingham Review, and McSweeney's Internet Tendency. His story, The Padman Chronicles, was nominated for a Pushcart Prize in 2008, and his story, The Body Eternal, was chosen as one of the 100 most distinguished stories of 2006 by Stephen King in the collection Best American Short Stories. This on its own would constitute an impressive biography and an enviable success story for a promising young writer. Peter, however, has also managed to write a magnificent debut novel. The House of Tomorrow, just published by Amy Einhorn Books, concerns 16-year-old Sebastian Prendergast, raised by his grandmother in a geodesic dome in eastern Iowa, according to the principles of futurist philosopher Buckminster Fuller. The House of Tomorrow has been widely reviewed and lavishly praised in the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Globe, the Minneapolis St. Paul Tribune, and Publishers Weekly, among others. Publishers Weekly awarded the novel a starred review and called it funny, unique, honest, noisy, and raucous. The popular literary blog The Rumpus called The House of Tomorrow tender and reflective and praised its sudden revelations of adult loneliness and its faithfulness to the uncool truths of teenage life. It is, to take a few pieces of a multifaceted design, the story of an eccentric, isolated boy venturing out into the larger dome of our universe, a psychological study of how certain kinds of teenagers, intelligent, artistic, confined, or disabled by circumstances, overcome their inhibitions and idiosyncrasies and forgive each other's weirdness to obtain the comfort of close relationships. It's also a case for punk rock, and indeed any music that empowers discontented youth as a sacred, adult-free space, a dome of noise in which young men and women can bond and voice their dreams and frustrations. I hope you'll join me in thanking whatever mysterious Fullerian force brought the Bognanni family to Iowa, and along with them Peter Bognanni and Sebastian Prendergast and his grandmother and their dome, and the Whitcomb family and all the other irresistible people and places and things in the House of Tomorrow. Please welcome a wonderful writer and a gifted architect, Peter Bognanni.
Wow, that really made me sound like an important person. I'm really humbled by how many people showed up here. I have to say that first. No one else is reading tonight, just so we're clear. And I'm not Peter Hedges. Unless you were going to buy my book thinking I'm Peter Hedges, then of course I am. I was thinking of something really original to say. But I'm just really excited to be here. Des Moines is where I grew up. Aside from those 9 months, I don't remember them very well. I remember my time in Des Moines a lot better, and it was a wonderful time. Before I get started with a few comments, I just want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank especially the Des Moines Public Library System and the AViD series for inviting me to speak, and especially Jan Kaiser, who's back there even now shuffling more people into their seats, for publicizing my event so much and also making me feel really important. And after just now finishing a semester of teaching a lot of college freshmen, it was really good for my ego to feel important for a while. And she totally made that happen. So, And I'd also like to thank Stephen for that wonderful introduction and briefly plug his book, Irreplaceable, which is really amazing, and you should read it. It's out in paperback now. So read that book too. You can read mine first, but you can read his second. You know, that's okay. So another thing that's special about being in Des Moines and being in a library is that, as it's been mentioned many times now, my mother is a librarian, and so I spent a lot of time in libraries growing up, whether it was coming to Story Hour as a kid, participating in summer reading programs, or being enslaved by my mother to do yard work around the old Franklin Library building, emptying the book drop on my winter vacation when it was below zero, or as just a random example that came to my head somehow, dressing as Clifford the Big Red Dog for a library parade when it was 90 degrees. And to her credit, she did get someone else to wear the suit first, but he didn't fit in it. So then I had to wear the suit. That makes for a good story. But in all seriousness, I think without all the books that my mom brought home for me and all the programs I attended at the library, I might not be standing here without my first novel. And library events were one of the first times in my life where I got to meet actual writers. I would come many, many times. Sometimes my mom would force me and say, "There's nobody in the crowd, you gotta come." And other times I came because I was excited to see the writer. But books were always very important in my house growing up. My father also has a master's in English and is a voracious reader himself. So books were very important, especially library books because you couldn't spill anything on them. But all books were important. I was surrounded by books and stories growing up. It was a wonderful way to grow up, and I'm sure that it's a very large part of the reason why I was able to be able to write this particular book. Also, I should say, if your mom's a librarian, then there's no way she can be against you becoming a writer. That's the other good thing about it. That'd be like a drug dealer saying to an addict, "I'm very ashamed of the choices you've made. How could this have happened?" So, now she has a weird writer on her hands, which is slightly better than a drug addict. But it wasn't just the library system that made me, I think, become a writer. It was also growing up in the Midwest, which might seem like a strange thing to say, since, as we all know, all writers come from New York City. I'm the only one who hasn't. I didn't get the memo. Grew up in Iowa, but recently someone was interviewing me, and they asked me if I considered myself to be a Midwestern writer. And I had to think about it for a minute because I wasn't sure if I was being insulted. I was thinking, well, what does that really mean to be a Midwestern writer? Eventually, I said I was for two very simple reasons, and that is that I was born in the Midwest and that I write about the Midwest. So that seemed like a fair bet. I guess I'm a Midwestern writer. But since then, I thought more about that, and so I wrote a little manual here that I'd like to share with you called "How to Be a Midwestern Writer" by Peter Bognanni. So here it goes. There are 10 steps. Step 1, be born in the Midwest. Step 1, Section B. If you want to be a very famous Midwestern writer, be born in the Midwest and be named F. Scott Fitzgerald. If this isn't your name, it won't work just to drink as much as F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was, after all, a professional. Step 2, write a book set in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, or if you're really desperate, maybe the Dakotas. But that should be a last resort scenario. Step 3. Why am I insulting the Dakotas? I don't know. They're an easy target. Step 3. Write books about Midwesty things. These may include, but are not limited to, small towns where people are very earnest and never laugh, farms where people are very earnest and never laugh, or small towns bordering farms where people are very earnest and never laugh. You may also write about a love affair that never happens because of strong Midwestern values, an animal that wins people's hearts with its determination and/or detective skills, or the dark underbelly of a small town where righteous Midwestern people are secretly evil and whose children live in cornfields, worship a corn god, and will chase you with farm tools and sew your eyes shut. Side note, Stephen King is not a Midwestern writer, but he did live in Wisconsin for a while. Step 4, avoid words like y'all, corn pones, and mama. These are for Southern writers. Step 5, avoid words like philander, ennui, and existential crisis. These are for East Coast writers. Step 6, avoid words like partida, biblioteca, and cerveza. These are for Spanish-speaking writers. And incidentally, the only words I could remember after taking 6 years of Spanish. 7, try not to have a funny-sounding last name with silent G's and multiple N's in odd places. This will totally ruin your Midwestern street cred, which is why I will be changing my name to Peter Goodhart for my next book. Step 8, When an interviewer asks you if you are a Midwestern writer, say yes. Step 9. When an interviewer tries to trick you and asks you if you secretly hate the Midwest and all of the people who live there, say no. Step 10. If none of this works, leave the Midwest as soon as possible and move to New York to write novels about philandering academics who suffer from ennui and chronic existential crisis. So follow that, and you too can be a Midwestern writer. But on a bit more serious note, I decided ultimately after I finished that interview that I was actually very proud to be a Midwestern writer and had no problem answering to the affirmative. And one of those reasons is that it seems to me still like an underrepresented region in literary fiction. That, I've read so many books about New York, I feel like I've lived there, but I could count the number of books I've read about Iowa on two hands, and I really sought them out. I was wanted to read books about other people that grew up in Iowa. And so I just feel like in some ways I want to do my part to sort of validate the experience of living in the Midwest and prove that interesting stories happen to people here too, and people have interesting lives here, and they fall in love and make horrible decisions, two things that are really good for fiction writing, at least my fiction writing, and they have wonderful senses of humor. And I feel like the sort of texture of life in the Midwest is something that I really care about and something that I know and want to write about. So ultimately I felt good about answering in the affirmative. And the second thing is that part of what I wanted to capture in the book was a sense of imagination and the way that just sort of opens up all your possibilities for the world. And so, living in Des Moines growing up, I have to say it wasn't perhaps as interesting as it is now. Des Moines somehow got really cool after I left. And not that it was the most horrible place on earth to live before, but there's so many more cultural things to do now. When I was growing up, I had to a lot of times, if I wanted to do something creative, really make my own fun. But I think that's one of the things that really made me want to do something creative was my friends and I would get together and we would write drama skits, like comedic skits, or we'd play in terrible bands, or, all of these things that we would do to pass the time at our houses and our friends' houses. And I kind of feel like if there'd been a bunch of really fascinating things to do here, then I might not have become a writer. And so, it's also about, I feel like I really had time to cultivate my imagination, and that was made possible by a lot of other things too, but partly by, kind of growing up here instead of perhaps, New York City. I'm really bashing New York tonight too for some reason. So another way of saying this is that Des Moines forced me to develop an imagination. And one that I think, has served me well. So I wrote another little piece here that I'd like to share, and it's actually a thank you letter to Des Moines. So I wrote the letter to Des Moines itself, which I think is listening right now. I can feel it in the air. So it goes like this. Dear Des Moines, how's it going? Are you still the capital of Iowa? Just kidding, I totally know you are. Anyway, it's me, your old resident, Peter Bognanni, formerly of 3200 45th Street and 4720 40th Street. Both pretty nice streets, as it turns out. I lived in you from around 1979 to about 1997. Most of the time I lived there, I was a skinny guy with a big nose. Ring any bells? Okay, full disclosure, Des Moines, I might have said I hated you a couple of times. But it was when I was young and angry for no discernible reason. Now you remember, right? Well, anyway, hopefully we can put that behind us, because now I'm writing to thank you. First of all, Des Moines, thank you for not being Detroit. I've never actually been there, but it sounds like a tough town that might have broken my fragile artistic spirit. So thanks for that. Thank you also for not being located directly on the equator, in the middle of two warring nations, or on the top of the dissolving polar ice caps. These are qualities I've always admired about you, Des Moines. And lastly, thank you for being decidedly unexciting in these dramatic ways, and to be perfectly honest, in some ways that I might have hoped for as a teenager. Let's face it, Des Moines, when I grew up on you, you erred a little on the side of safety and predictability. Now don't be ashamed, that was just your style. You preferred khakis to jeans, the Beatles to the Stones, and family parades to riots. But even though I might have enjoyed the occasional riot when I was young, or even a concert or two not aimed at baby boomers, I'm glad you kept things mellow around here, because instead of doing those things, I hung out in my room, or my friend's room, becoming a more interesting person. For instance, I painted pictures. Okay, yes, some of them were pictures of naked women, but it was still painting. I wrote bad poetry. I read amazing books. I listened to more music than a reasonable person should. I learned how to play at least 6 chords on the guitar, though I still have trouble with D minor and bar chords hurt my hand. Essentially, Des Moines, I learned how to entertain myself, which is really good training for becoming a writer. Because being a writer is basically just entertaining yourself in a quiet room for about 3 hours a day, and then hoping that someday, somewhere, a reader will share those feelings. It's about developing an imagination that is just as strong as your sense of reality. It's about learning to live in that imagination and mold it until it becomes something compelling and meaningful. It's about using your imagination as a form of communication with another human being that you don't even know. And along with giving me a great education, an amazing group of friends and teachers, and some nice arts and youth athletic programs, you made this possible, Des Moines. So Des Moines, I know you think you're pretty hip these days with your good restaurants, fun bars, burgeoning art scene, but don't go too crazy. Don't give the kids too much to do, because there might be a few of them who need time to cultivate something important. And if you build too many skate parks, and concert venues, then they won't have time to try to become artists. Thanks again, Des Moines. Keep it real. Your friend, Peter. P.S. Don't tell Detroit what I said about it. I am not very good at fighting. So, this discussion about the Midwest, or we're not really having a discussion, I guess I'm talking at you. This lecture about the Midwest is probably a good time to start talking about my book, since that's probably why AViD had me here, not to read little things that amuse myself about Des Moines and how to be a Midwestern writer. So, this is my book. I think it's pretty handsome. I don't know about you guys. It only took me 1 failed novel, 2.5 years, a year and a half to edit, and another year to publish it, and now I can wave it around. It's an object, which feels pretty good. The book came about in a lot of different ways. There are just a couple I want to touch on, and then I'll read a little section from it. But one of these ways was my time at the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is another connection to Iowa that makes coming back to Des Moines feel so special. And that's really where they taught me how to craft all of my crazy ideas and ridiculous, sometimes bad jokes into something readable. And there were a couple of ways they did that, but one of the basic ways that the workshop helped me was by making me much more receptive to emotional diversity in my work, which is something I wanted to talk about briefly. Before I went to Iowa, I was essentially trying to be a humorist. I went for the laugh on every page, and I thought good writing was just basically about being as clever as possible. But when I really started examining what I liked to read, I realized that it wasn't always a book that was all laughs. It was something that had a great amount of sort of emotional diversity to it. And so I started thinking about that and starting to work more of that into my book. And I had a great teacher while I was there, Elizabeth McCracken. I think she's been here before to read in Des Moines. But she said one day in class, the sad makes the funny funnier. And the funny makes the sad sadder. And that's always true. And given the sort of multitude of crazy emotions that we all feel on a given day, I might be talking about myself mostly, but other people too, it seems kind of unfair to write a book that's all laughs or that beats the sad drum over and over and over again. I don't know what the sad drum sounds like, but it sounds very depressing and droning. And that, so one thing that I was really trying to do in this book, which is a really relatively simple idea, is to just try to capture the emotional diversity of my characters' lives, to be open to the emotional unpredictability of life, the funny moments happening at unexpected times, the poignant, tender moments also coming when you least expect them. Because ultimately I wrote a book with a comic conceit at its center. My protagonist has been homeschooled in a completely clear geodesic dome according to a somewhat obscure architect and philosopher, Buckminster Fuller. Then he goes on to form a terrible high school punk band. And I landed on these ideas mostly because I found them funny, and they amused me. And I thought it would be a really fun book to write. Yet, at the heart of the book, I realized more and more as I was writing it, these are also a lot of isolated characters that are really looking for human connection. And the sort of sadness and some loneliness that's in the book started to come out a little bit more too. And just what it's like to be young and generally a little bit confused about the world, which I think is something, no matter what age you are, that you can kind of hearken back to. Or maybe you're still confused about the world. And so it's a more general feeling. So what I really wanted to do was try to combine the sort of sad and humorous in this book and really sort of capture life in all of its depth, if I could. So I'd like to read a little from the book now. I'm going to read two relatively short sections. One is just a little from the beginning of the book. I think Stephen sort of summed it up nicely. The protagonist of the book, though, is a 16-year-old boy who's been raised in a geodesic dome by his very eccentric grandmother. He's been homeschooled. He has a very sort of formal way of speaking. So in case you're wondering when that starts, that's on purpose. And on the one hand, is very naive, knows absolutely nothing about life, but on the other hand, is very kind of wise beyond his years just from the education that he's gotten. So I'm just going to read a couple of the opening pages to give you a sense for his voice and kind of how he sees the world, and then I'm going to skip ahead to a little bit longer scene that I'll read. So the first chapter, all the chapters are numbered, is called Welcome to the Future. The chapters are usually numbered, I guess. They're titled, too. It was really innovative of me to number the chapters in this book. Think back on it. Okay, so welcome to the future. Every single human being is part of a grand universal plan. That's what my Nana always says. We're not alive just to lounge around and contemplate our umbilicus. We're metaphysical beings. Open us up and there's more rattling around in there than just brain sacs and fatty tissue. We are full of imperceptible essences, invisible spectrums, patterns, ideas. We are containers of awesome phenomena, which is why it's important to live right. You have to be attuned to what's around you, and you have to keep from clogging your receptors with crap. According to my Nana, the universe is sending signals every day, and it's up to us whether or not we want to listen. We can either perk up our ears or walk around like dead piles of dermis. I always preferred the former, which is why I found myself on the top of the roof of our dome on that fall Sunday when everything began. I couldn't tell you for certain that I'd ever heard messages from space up there, but at the very least I had a tremendous view. Hanging in the brisk October air, Anver heavy-duty suction cups on my hands, and a no-slip rubber guard harness around my chest, I could see the entire town of North Branch, arranged with the uniformity of an architectural model. It stretched below me like a wide lake of split-level dwellings, flowing over the small hills and dips in the eastern Iowa landscape. And above the horizon was the endless ice-blue troposphere, nearly unobstructed save for the waving branches of our black walnut trees. It was this towering group of trees that gave me my official reason for ascending to the top of the dome that Sunday. Every autumn, they bombarded our translucent roof with pungent green-shelled nuts the size of tennis balls, and it was my job to climb the walls like a salamander and scrub away the stains. For this purpose, I kept a large squeegee strapped to my back, along with a small bucket of orange-scented cleaning solution, and once attached to the glass, I scrubbed each insulated panel and kept an eye on my Nana inside at the same time. Right beneath me, through a soapy triangle of glass, I could see her on her Nordic track, grinding away. Click-clacketa, click-clacketa, click-clacketa. The sound was like a distant zephyr train. Just the day before, she had told me that most human beings only saw 100,000th of the world in their lifetime, maybe a 10,000th if they traveled a lot. Only she called the world Spaceship Earth, because that's what Buckminster Fuller called it, and she thought he was humanity's last real genius. Either way, I was sure I could see my entire portion from this spot. Up on top of the dome, my view was quite possibly someone's whole lifetime. So that's the way the book begins. I'm going to skip ahead now to another section. One thing that I wanted to mention before I read this is that another thing I was really trying to capture in the book was the transformative effect of music on these characters. And that I read about punk rock a lot in this book, which most people consider to be this really angry, raucous music, but it actually has a very kind of unexpectedly poignant effect on these two boys and allows them to form a friendship, even though they sort of thought of themselves as outcasts. So this is my plea to get you to listen to more punk rock too. It's really about friendship. Not about breaking things or, rioting or sniffing glue. The Ramones wrote a song about that. So the other character that's important in this book is Jared Whitcomb, and he is another 16-year-old, kind of the complete opposite of Sebastian. He's a punk rock wannabe. He's a chain smoker. He has a bit of a problem with profanity, which I'm going to try to edit out since this is going to be on television. So if I come across a word and I can't think of anything interesting, I'll probably just say bleep. And then you can imagine your own word in there, and it's really going to be an interactive experience for all of us. But I think I've picked a section that's not too heavy on that. Anyway, so this is the first time that Sebastian goes over to Jared's house for band practice. Jared has convinced Sebastian that they need to start a two-man punk band. Sebastian doesn't know how to play an instrument. Jared barely knows, but no punk band ever let that stop them. So this is, in case there's a mention in here of Meredith, that's Jared's older sister, who Sebastian is falling in love with, even though he probably doesn't really know what that is or means. Okay, so this is a little bit longer section. When I arrived at the Whitcombs, I stashed my bicycle in the usual location and paused to make sure I had removed my helmet. I had almost left it sitting on the counter of the paint store moments ago. The store had been minutes from closing, and I'd had to rush to make my selections. Now I left the helmet hanging from a handlebar. As I moved toward the front of the house, I looked at Meredith's window for a second, but the shade was not open, and there was no sign of her shadow inside. "What are you looking for?" came a voice from nearby. I surveyed the yard, but there was no one there. "Up here," said Jared. I looked up and found him sitting on the lowest branch of a beech tree in his front yard. He was kicking at one of the dangling purple tennis shoes, smoking a cigarette. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "That's Meredith's room." "Why are you in a tree?" I said. "I asked you first." "I was looking up at your room," I said, "not hers." "Why are you in a tree?" Jared sighed. "I like to climb this tree, okay? And Janice doesn't let me do it anymore because she happens to be a Nazi. So when she's gone, I climb it." I nodded. Jared exhaled a puff of smoke. "What's the story with the shoes?" I asked. "These stupid things," he said, kicking again at one of them. "Meredith keeps them up here on this branch for good luck, she says, but I think they're a signal for guys to come over here and feel her up." "But they're up there all the time," I said. "Exactly." I walked over just below the tree and looked straight up at him. His undersized legs hung over the branch like a small child's. He tapped his cigarette and the gray ashes floated past me to the ground. I still had the guitar on my back and it was getting heavy. "I thought we were having band practice," I said. "We are," he said, "in a minute. I've been inside all day. Just let me get a breath of fresh air for once." He took a deep drag on his cigarette. I took down the bass and sat on the frigid ground beneath the tree. I rested the instrument on my lap and ran my fingers thoughtlessly over the strings. "Needs to be tuned," said Jared. Another flick of ashes fluttered down around me like dirty snow. Some of it landed on my shoulders. "Let me ask you something," Jared said. "What?" "Do you think girls will want to get it on with me when we're famous?" I paused for a moment to let him know I was really giving this some thought. "I think so," I said. "I've done some research about this." Jared kicked at the shoes. "Yeah," he said, "famous people have to have bodyguards to punch out crazy fans and screaming girls. Doesn't matter if you're small or whatever. People just want your booty if you're an artist." It appears that way, I said. Fame's not going to change me, though, he said. I'm not going to sell out. I'm going to be the same Jared. I'm just going to rock out and get it on with my groupies. That's it. And maybe make a horror movie later in my career about brain-eating werewolves. Something cool like that. Good idea, I said. I looked up and saw he was watching me. It was hard to see his eyes. His glasses were reflecting the porch light from the house, but his jaw was tense. What's wrong? I asked. He took one last drag on his cigarette. Janice wants me to start school again by the end of the month. He was quiet a moment. Then he dropped his cigarette butt from the tree like a guided missile. It landed in a splash of orange sparks on a patch of dirt. I've never been to a real school before, I said. I know, said Jared. I used to think you were a homeschooled moron. Now I think you might be the luckiest person I know. He started moving toward the base of the tree, shifting his thighs over and holding tight to the branch. High school is worse than you can even believe, he said. The guys are all a bunch of chuckleheads. The girls are all versions of my sister. Everybody likes sports, and the classrooms smell like armpit. Jared began sliding down the trunk of the tree, dirtying his black pants. It's hell on earth, Sebastian, plain and simple, he said, grunting. He let go of the tree and fell to the ground, landing hard on his sneakers. He walked around his yard a minute, shaking his ankles. His leather jacket hung down like a cape, and in the dark he could have been mistaken for a broken-winged vampire. Finally, he loped back around and stood above me. He took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. What am I going to do? Are you scared? I asked. Jared didn't say anything. He pressed his glasses back on his nose. We should probably go inside, he said. My free days are numbered, and we have some serious bleeping work to do. Was that fun? Did you imagine your own work? Yeah, I said. Yeah, he said. We walked over the yard and up the steps. We wiped our feet on the mat, and I couldn't help looking down. God bless this house. I looked back up, quickly making sure not to hit the base on the door frame. Before we could practice, we needed supplies. So we stopped in the kitchen and filled 2 large tumblers full of grape drink and big blocky ice cubes. Then we stopped at the pantry for some kind of bright orange crackers with peanut butter in the middle. It looked like food from another planet, but it tasted incredible. Salty, sweet, orange. I washed it down with a long drink of the grape stuff and closed my eyes to fully enjoy the taste. It was so cold, so sweet. This drink certainly did not come from a co-op. It was certainly not organic. It was delicious poison. Loaded down with our provisions, we headed down the hall toward the stairwell. Jared paused for a second in front of Meredith's door, and I wondered momentarily if he was somehow aware of the calls I'd been making. The door was shut tight, and a strain of despairing music was barely muffled by the door. Lucky for us, she's been acting like a suicide case all day, said Jared. Usually when Janice is gone, she goes into ultra bleep mode. But I noticed on her door earlier that she was just lying on her bed, looking out the window like some abused puppy. It was pathetic. Maybe she's in love, I said, and instantly regretted it. Yeah, said Jared, and maybe I have a 15-inch wiener. We both looked at her door. Then I still find that joke funny. I'm 31 years old. We both looked at her door. Then we walked up the stairs and into Jared's room. Once we were settled, Jared made multiple trips to the closet for tangled cords and little boxes he called effects pedals. He produced his amplifier, and then another small one for me. The humidifier puffed and burbled in the corner, but the room smelled better this time. He worked quietly, plugging things in, flipping switches, tuning his guitar, and then tuning my bass. When he was finished, we both sat on his unmade bed, our instruments buzzing like enormous cicadas. What do we do now? I asked. Give me a minute to think, said Jared. Why do you always have to ask things? Jared coughed. We were close enough to touch elbows. Well, how did you begin the practices with your other bands? I asked. What other bands? I thought you performed in other bands. When the hell did I ever say that? I assumed, I said. Don't assume things, he said. You don't know anything. Jared looked at his guitar. I looked at my bass. We met eyes again. I can play an A minor chord, I said. Jared seemed to think about this a minute. Okay, he said, let's hear your A minor chord. I took some time to carefully adjust my fingers into the correct positions. D string, A string, E string. I strummed with my thumb, and there it was again, that perfect, deep, dulcet tone. It poured from the baby amplifier. I felt it in my toes. And as if answering an alarm, Jared immediately stomped on one of his pedals, put his fingers in position. Before the sound of my chord disappeared, he answered it with a growling riff from his guitar. The two sounds met and clapped together like waves. Then they blended and left the air of the room altogether. Synergy. Do that again, said Jared. Thank you. So before I answer questions, which I will do in approximately 20 seconds, I just want to thank everyone again. I think, aside from just coming to see me, which is really great too, it's really exciting to see so many people come out to hear a fiction writer and to come to an event at a library. It's just, it's really heartening. And I think that AViD is a great thing. I'm so excited to be a part of it. And, just going out and hearing authors in some ways has almost become a thing that happens less. And so you should all feel really good about yourselves, if for no other reason. And you came out to support an up-and-coming writer, and you came to the library, which is a wonderful place and was kind of my, home away from home growing up. And so, take, 2 seconds now to feel good about that. Or feel good about it while I'm moving over to take questions. But so, thanks. I'll be happy to do some questions now. Let's do it. Did you bring your guitar?
Is that better? Can you hear that?
You kind of have to put it inside of your mouth, I think.
Okay. Well, look, he's trying to escape before I ask him any questions.
Although they even put a bottle over here for me. You can have this one.
No, that's okay. Well, Peter and I know each other a little bit, but I had absolutely no idea how funny he was. So this is like a huge discovery for me.
Usually I'm really depressing.
Well, and I'm a little more serious and so forth. So I prepared some more serious questions for you, which you can answer in a funny way if they're too serious. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
So why did you number all the chapters? Did you ever think about using letters or?
Yeah, right. I thought about using base 10, but it seemed a little too abstract.
Okay. Well, I know there's some cards going around the room, so let me, if you want to. Okay, if there are some cards in the program, if you'd like to fill those out and write questions on them, Jan will collect them and bring them up, and I'll be happy to read them to Peter. But,
I want the craziest ones.
You want the craziest
ones?
If
possible.
Okay. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, I know that when you were in the workshop or after the workshop, it seems like you were mostly writing short stories. Is that right? And
yeah.
And I wonder what happened I wondered how you made the transition from writing short stories to working on either this novel or another novel, and what that was like in terms of your own process, what the difficulties were, what was exciting about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it really is kind of a hard transition, because in most MFA programs you go to, you're constantly writing short stories because there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can bring them to workshop. People can say, this is a self-contained unit. I either liked it or I hated it, and it's very convenient. As far as writing a novel goes, I would say one of the biggest differences is that you're doing it by yourself, in my case, for about 2.5, 3 years, with very little feedback. So aside from just the formal challenge of writing something that's 350 pages, it's also, after coming out of school and getting all this great feedback on your writing, it really feels like a very solitary thing. It's just kind of me and the desk and the wall. Occasionally my wife, if I actually showed her some pages. So that in itself was kind of terrifying at first. But then also, I think you kind of just, for me, I just kept writing short stories and waiting for the one that seemed like it wanted to blow up and be something bigger, and just waiting for that natural moment. And that was the case with this. I started writing this idea, and it just seemed like it didn't want to be contained in 15 pages.
Yeah. And just a quick follow-up. During the course of writing the book, what would you say were the greatest challenges or the difficulties or triumphs, or what was it like as an experience from starting out in the beginning to kind of the point where you were all, had it really finished or close to finished?
This is going to sound like a joke answer, but it's really not a joke answer. Okay. Sitting in the chair. Sitting in the chair every day and writing for a lot of times 3 hours a day. It's a really hard thing to do. And actually sometimes harder than the writing itself, because I'm very easily distracted. So the office where I write at home just faces a wall, and I keep my blinds shut all day. It's this horribly depressing cave. And because even if the guy outside is mowing his lawn and I look at him, then I can't write. So I have to stare at this wall. But aside from staring at the wall, I think one of the biggest challenges actually was not losing interest in the project and trying to keep it fresh for myself all the way through, because I really kind of fell in love with these characters. But like any great love affair, there are some days where you wake up in the morning when you might not necessarily want to see that person. That is in no way a reflection on my marriage. But even the people that you love sometimes annoy you, and it's the same with characters that you write about. There were some days where I just wanted to be like, do I really have to get up and write in this weird kid's perspective again today? Can I write a story about someone normal or, like an adult? And so I would say actually just trying to keep the imagination rolling and keeping things fresh was a really big challenge when working on it.
Yeah. All right, well, I have some questions here to try out on you. And the first one of these is, were you one of those kids who was constantly telling stories and amazing your friends with your, quote, experiences?
I have some friends in the audience, so I have to be careful how I paint myself here. I would like to believe, yes, that I was an amazing storyteller. I think there were different parts of my personality, though, that are also kind of reflected in the two characters in this book. I think there is one side of me that was involved in theater and was very extroverted and very much wanted to sort of tell stories and try to make people laugh. And then there was another part of me that was kind of introspective that I think eventually led me toward writing a little bit more, where I might have done a lot more listening of other people's stories and filing them away to someday put them in a book. Preferably the most embarrassing ones. But then you change their names and it's all okay.
I like this question. It kind of gets back to the characters in your book that you were talking about. Which of your characters do you feel that you most relate to, and why?
That's interesting. Yeah, it does get to that. I feel like I'm somewhat a combination of the two young boys that are in this book. It kind of gets to what I was just talking about. I'd like to say, just for the sake of making myself sound really cool, that I was Jared, and I always had some awesome, sarcastic, pithy reply on the tip of my tongue. And so maybe that's the person I wanted to be, but ultimately I think on the inside I was more like Sebastian, maybe a little bit more sort of kind of thoughtful, but some combination of both, I think, ultimately.
And just sort of a follow-up, how did you find it? I mean, the women characters in this book, to me, were just amazing. I thought Nana could have just been sort of a mouthpiece for Mr. Fuller and Fullerian philosophy. Instead, she was this very sympathetic, warm woman who I really end up feeling a lot for by the end of the book. And the same with Janice and Meredith. How was it writing the women characters in the book?
Yeah, for some reason I felt it was one of the first times that I ever felt really comfortable writing those female characters. I wrote one short story at Iowa from the perspective of a woman the entire time I was there. Just because I think it should be within a writer's repertoire to be able to do that, but it's just hard. And you feel like people are going to call you out as a fraud and say something like, well, as a woman, you don't know what you're talking about at all. But in this case, I knew that I wanted these female characters in particular, the adult characters, to have a lot going on, because they both, I think, at first in the book seem like very easy to pin down. As you said, the grandmother seems very eccentric and kooky and almost kind of domineering. And Janice, I think at first just seems like kind of like a sad, single mother who runs this sort of also semi-depressing youth group. But as you move through the book, hopefully this will be your experience, there's a lot more to uncover about them. And that it's, in a sense, I think what helped me with them was just making sure that they were complex characters and not just the mother or the grandmother in a book that was really about these other characters. I wanted to give them their due.
Oh, and you did. I mean, they're incredible. This story, or this question here, was the whole novel in your head when you started, or did the story develop and evolve as you wrote? Did you know how it was going to end and where it was going to go, or did you?
I didn't know how it was going to end. I had some ideas. I was speaking at Central Academy this morning to a bunch of ninth graders, some of who came to see me again, which I think is, hey, they're raising their hands. That's amazing. If your parents are here, parents, you should be very proud of them. They could have been home on Facebook. They could have been doing, the Twitter, the tweetering, I believe as they call it. Instead, they're here listening to a fiction writer. But I told them this morning that I felt a little bad at first when I was writing the book that I didn't know how it was going to end. I thought, boy, am I an amateur. All real writers must know how their books are going to end. But then I was reading a biography of Flannery O'Connor at that exact time, in which she said in a chapter that she never knew how her stories were going to end. And that in the famous story of hers where the prosthetic leg gets stolen, Good Country People, she had no idea that was going to happen when she started the story. And got to that moment in the story where she was like, this Bible salesman is going to steal this prosthetic leg. Good story, by the way, now that I've ruined it for you. But I had a similar moment where as I was drawing toward the end of the book, suddenly I was like, oh, and I won't ruin my book for you, this other really cool thing that you'll get to when you read my book is going to happen. And that's the way the book is going to end. And to tell you the truth, I was actually okay with that process. I felt like the fact that I was surprised by it would maybe mean that a reader would be surprised by it as well.
This question is, I think, can lead to some interesting things. Buckminster Fuller, why?
That's pretty good. Okay, well, one answer to this is that one of the reasons this novel came about is because I was at a party with my wife, and she was talking to a very strange man at this party. Sometimes when we're at parties, I kind of keep an eye on who she's talking to, not in a really weird, jealous way, but just, and I happened to notice she was talking to this guy for a while. And then on the car ride home, she said, that guy Scott? I said, yeah, I think I know who that is. She's like, that guy was raised in a geodesic dome by his grandmother. And I immediately, my gears started turning. I think I was like quiet for the rest of the whole ride home. I had nothing else to say. And then in the morning, I started writing in this voice. So anyway, I started researching geodesic domes in the morning. I was like, what is a geodesic dome? What is that? So I was reading about it. Buckminster Fuller is the inventor of the geodesic dome, so I stumbled across him that way. And then I just became absolutely obsessed and fascinated with him. He's just one of those great oddball historical figures who was like half insane, half a genius, just so endlessly funny and interesting to me that I just started finding myself writing more and more about him in the book and putting his sort of crazy philosophy in the book until it seemed like, it was really adding something weighty and didn't seem like it was sort of forced in there. So that's the natural way it came about. I had no idea who he was until that day. So I'm not like a long-time Fuller freak or anything. My parents didn't raise me in some kind of New Age experiment or anything like that.
I won't ask you if you were raised in a geodesic dome. I think someone else already asked you that.
There was a guy who wouldn't let me say no. He was like, asked me 3 times. I was like, no, I was raised in a house that was a square shape. And he's like, but it was a dome, right? No. But it had a dome roof?
This question is, well, actually, there are a couple sort of writer questions here. One, this person's book club would really like to see this as a movie. Can you see this as a movie? Or that's one of those questions you have to kind of throw out.
Do I get paid for this?
I think you
in
might.
In this
it says
hypothetical?
on the card that you would get paid if there were a movie.
How much? No, okay. So I would love to see this as a movie. Obviously, I think it'd be really cool. I actually teach a screenwriting class at McAllister College. And one year I actually taught a class on adaptation from books to film. Mostly our consensus was that they always ruin the books, but sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's really exciting. And I think that I'm actually a person who's very interested in film and movies, so to me it would be really cool, but I have no idea if it'll ever happen.
Would you want to write the screenplay if they came to you and offered it?
Yes, I want all the power and the glory.
This question is about how the title came to you. Did you know what the title was going to be for a long time? Did you have other titles?
No, the title was the most traumatic thing you could have possibly brought up, aside from the cover, which I really like now, by the way, but I didn't like the initial versions. The title, to me, though, is it's the name of the tourist attraction. The Dome is also a tourist attraction, so that's one reason why it seemed fitting. The reason I eventually went with it, too, is that I think there's a bit of a double meaning there that I like, which is that Sebastian, this character, is really, I think, looking for a place to call home in the book, and he's kind of shuffling back and forth between the Dome and between the Whitcombs family's house, and never really knows which house he's going to be in tomorrow, or, what's going to happen. Of course, it's also got this sort of retro future thing. Nobody says this anymore, like the car of tomorrow or the house of tomorrow. It's kind of an antiquated phrase, but like the geodesic dome is an antiquated version of the future. Buckminster Fuller really thought, okay, by the year 2000, maybe sooner, everyone is going to be living in domes. We're going to be a bunch of dome people. And it never really happened. And that's part of also, I think, the kind of a sadness that Nana is dealing with in the book, is that this huge legacy she hoped to inherit has kind of fallen into disrepair. And this future that she really hoped would make her famous has never really happened. So the idea of tomorrow there, I think, plays in a couple of different ways. So ultimately, I was happy with it. I don't have any other. I just repressed this whole process. I don't even remember what the other titles were.
So we shouldn't call you the author of tomorrow.
No, it just proves that my future will never come.
This person noticed some secret Des Moines references buried in the text, like AViD and a manual. I think it says UHC. Is that right? Not being from Des Moines, I'm not sure.
Oh, the church.
Yeah. Any other buried Des Moines references?
There's buried Iowa references all over the place. I created the town in the book. There is a town called North Branch in Iowa, but I made my own fictional version. And why I did that was partly to sort of celebrate all of these places that I love all over Iowa. So I have some relatives here from Ottumwa, Iowa, and I stole wholesale this place called the Canteen, which is this really great little restaurant that has these amazing hamburgers. And so I put that in North Branch. There's a record store in Iowa City called the Record Collector that I really like. I'm sure you've been there. Has anybody worked there in here? Okay, no. The people who work there are really pretentious. So I put a pretentious record store owner in there too, in the Record Collector, and then everything. I just found myself putting all these things in, and I was like, well, I could give them fake names and mask it, but maybe I should just actually kind of give a shout out or celebrate all these different things of Iowa, streets I lived on, addresses where I knew people. So they all kind of filtered into the book. And since so much of this book is purely fictional and has nothing to do with my actual life, it was like a small thrill to put some autobiographical details in there.
This question is, what Iowa authors did you enjoy reading? Or we could expand that afterwards to just say, who are some of the writers you find inspiring, or maybe during the course of writing this book, writers who were on your desk that you were thinking about?
Well, I do have to say that the person I said I was not earlier, Peter Hedges, was an influence. Some people have compared this book actually to What's Eating Gilbert Grape, which I'm really flattered by. But I remember that I read that book when I was young, and knowing that the writer grew up in Des Moines was just inspiring to me. I thought that writers did not come from here. As I said earlier, I thought they all lived in New York City somewhere in like a secret borough that I didn't even know about, where they just sent out work and it was all immediately published, and they became incredibly famous and walked around smoking cigars, wearing monocles. But writers come from Iowa too, and that was kind of a big moment for me. I would say just in general, the writer that got me back into reading after my teenage rebellious years that lasted maybe about a year, where I thought books were stupid. The writer who brought me back from the dark side is probably Kurt Vonnegut. I mentioned him a lot. I read all the way through his books. I worked at an ice cream store in Merle Hay Mall, and I would sit there reading Kurt Vonnegut books all through my shift, and when somebody came for ice cream, I'd kind of look up and glare at them, and I'd just serve them their ice cream cone. Then I'd go back to reading Kurt Vonnegut, thinking I was really cool and edgy, and destined to be a writer.
Who were some of your influences or writers that you felt particularly drawn to or inspired by as you were writing this book? Were there any in particular, or just?
I mentioned Flannery O'Connor. Most people read her short stories. She also has great novels. And there's this novel I read when I was working on this called The Violent Bear It Away. And it's a fantastic book. And it has characters in it. It has a teenage protagonist who's kind of under the thumb of a very religious uncle who thinks he's a prophet. And that relationship probably had a direct influence on the relationship between Nana and Sebastian, even though there's nothing to do with religion. But just that idea of growing up in a household where you're raised according to a very certain dogma, that kind of, I think, came over. And then just really voicey, funny, young adult narrators. Certainly got to mention Catcher in the Rye. Have all the ninth graders read that yet? You should really put that on your list soon. And The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, if you've read that. I love the narrator of that book, just how sort of eccentric and funny and how much energy that narration had to it and just that strange way of speaking that he has. And so I read a lot of first-person novels with voices that I just thought had a tremendous amount of energy and momentum, but still a little bit of like a lyrical quality to them. And I wish I could think of more, but definitely the O'Connor novel and eventually the Curious Incident. Those were two big ones.
This person wants to know if the punk band you played in was A, atrocious, B, horrendous, or C, terrible.
All of the above. I'm adding D. I'm not even sure if it's fair to call it a punk band. I don't think I even knew enough chords to like be that evolved. It was basically just me and some friends playing as loud as we could in a sort of attic space above a Thai restaurant downtown. And it was in the restaurant district, so there was no noise regulations. And we would just go over there and play our 5 or 6 chords as loud as we possibly could. And there was a drum set that someone would beat on as loud as possible, but it was great. It was like the most cathartic thing you could do. It was just go over there and do that. And so that and aside from the music itself, just having fun doing something creative at that time with friends, it really was something that appealed to me and something I knew I wanted to write about, because I think it was a great experience for me. And also just music has been really important for me in my life, being really interested in that. And I think that's another thing, along with books, that really expand your imagination and broaden your view of the world. And as I said even before, something as hateful as punk rock can do it. Can just give you at least you can vent your anger. But aside from that, it probably has a little more to offer.
Do you still 2 more questions? Okay. Do you still play any music? Are you still a musician, or do you still aspire to maybe have a public performance at some point?
I decided for the benefit of the world to give up on music. Sometimes I still play the guitar, but when I went to Iowa, actually, I made the very conscious decision to leave my guitar behind, because I spent a lot of time playing it, and I was like, I'm a writer now. I'm going to spend that time writing instead of learning how to play Black Sabbath songs or something. It might be a better use of my time. I would actually love to play guitar again. It's probably something I'll do down the line. In terms of like trying to start one of those really sad like midlife crisis rock bands, I don't know. Actually, now that I said that out loud, it sounds kind of fun. But I was going to say I'll never do that. But now it sounds great. I also hope to get my first tattoo at the age of 50. I don't have any yet. But the midlife crisis rock band and tattoo, that's what I'm going to do.
What about a midlife crisis punk band?
Oh, yeah, even better. Yeah. There'll be all kinds of people waiting for a resurgence of that. We can just...
Okay.
Can be about The 50-year-old Ramones cover band. That's kind of what the Ramones turned into, actually.
All right, well, I guess that's all the questions we have time for, so thank you so much to all of you for coming out to the library tonight to hear Peter Bognanni, and thank you, Peter Bognanni.
Thank you. I'll be happy to sign books.
He's signing books. Right there.